Just a quick overview of the agenda. We'll be reviewing officer positions, governing documents, board meeting basics, tips for board meetings, and then I'll turn it over to Julia, who will be going over financials, reserve studies. We'll do a brief overview of our Vanica board portal. If you are interested in learning more about the portal, we do offer 2 training sessions a month on that as well for board members. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have time for questions and answers at the very end. All right, so first are the board officer positions. This might vary per association, but typically the required board officer positions are outlined within the bylaws for your individual association. So the 3 most common positions the documents call for are the president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary. So the first is the president, which typically serves as the liaison between the board and management. They preside over the board and annual meetings, but the president is really just that in name. You don't have more power or a bigger voting right than the rest of the board. You simply act as that liaison, and the president cannot veto votes. Next is the vice president. This isn't always an officer position that's called for in governing documents, but essentially the vice president steps in to fulfill the duties of the president if they're not available, and kind of assist with the president's day-to-day duties. Next is the treasurer. This is really the person who's responsible for working with the staff accountant at CAMCO to review the monthly financials and also assist with your annual audit with the outside CPA firm. And the treasurer also helps oversee the budgeting process on an annual basis. And then finally is the secretary. The secretary ensures that meeting minutes are taken and approved. They're entrusted with maintaining the records of the association or working with the management company to make sure that the items are maintained and posted to the portal. And they also oversee the process of giving notice to the board and association of any meetings such as the annual meeting, a budget meeting, or any community meetings that might happen throughout the year. So next are the governing documents and their purpose. Your association has governing documents, and there's kind of many that are used, but we're going to focus on the 3 most common this evening, which are the declarations, the bylaws, and the rules and regulations. So what the governing documents do, they define the rights and obligations of the community owners. They really create the binding relationship between the owner and the community association. It establishes the mechanism for governing and funding the community association, and it sets forth rules and standards. And these rules and standards are really put in place to protect the owners and the community, enhance your property values, and promote harmonious living. So first is the declaration, which depending on what state you operate in or what type of association you are, it might be referred to as the declaration, the covenants, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or the master deed. I will refer to this as the declaration, as that's probably the most common. So the declaration defines the portions of the community owned by the individual owner and what's owned by the community association. So it establishes what is considered a common element, a limited common element, and what the owner is responsible for maintaining. It establishes the binding relationship between the owners and the community association. It establishes the standards and restrictions which promote harmonious living. It establishes the framework for community associations and its management. It provides the outline for financial support. So in your declaration, you're typically going to find the percentage ownership for each unit within the association. And then if you're a newer community, it also outlines the plan of transition from the developer over to the homeowners association. Next are the bylaws. The bylaws outline the administration and management of the community. It defines the requirements for membership, for member meetings. It defines the voting rights of members. It provides the procedure for electing the board of directors. It It also outlines the different board officer positions, as we talked about earlier, or the number of board members required. And it also defines the general powers and duties of the board. And then lastly, you have your rules and regulations. This is really the document I find that board members reference most often. And the rules and regulations reiterate the standards and restrictions that are listed in the other governing documents. It outlines the policy and procedures in more details. So for example, it establishes your architectural request policies or your maintenance standards, things such as noise policies, leasing policies, whether a homeowner needs to provide a lease or if there's a limited, amount of time that something can be leased. It defines trash and recycling policies. Those are just a few examples, but your rules and regulations really build upon items that are outlined within the other documents. And also within the rules and regulations, it defines the process for levying fines should the owner be in violation. Next, you have the responsibilities and powers of the board. So you as board members have what's called a fiduciary responsibility. You must always act in the best interest of the association. And it really comes down to a duty of care, which is making informed decisions, and also a duty of loyalty, acting fairly in good faith for the benefit of the association. You as board members also have to enforce the governing documents and rules and regulations, which is why it's important you understand what they are and where they can be found. And it's really important to remember, going back to your duty of loyalty and care, the enforcement of rules and regulations needs to be done uniformly and consistently. So you can't make exceptions for one person. You really have to make sure that you're upholding the standards for everyone. And the board does have the right and the power to change the rules and regulations with due process. So you can certainly add additional rules or clarify rules. It is important to remember that you cannot adopt a new rule that necessarily conflicts with something that's already in your declaration or bylaws. And if there is something within the declaration or bylaws, typically that requires a vote of the entire association. So a little bit about board meetings. You might hear us refer to open meetings or closed meetings. So open board meetings are meetings that are open to the entire membership to attend. Typically in those situations, there's either a time at the beginning or the end of the open portion where the owners are allowed to ask questions, and then they can sit in and listen to the rest of the board meeting. Closed meetings are simply meetings that take place between management and the board. And then there's also what's called executive session. This is where more sensitive items are discussed. So items such as collections, violations, things that pertain to individual homeowners that need to have discretion and confidentiality are discussed during executive session. If you do have open meetings where the membership is invited, executive session always takes place after the membership has left. Next is the agenda and the meeting format. So this is a typical example of how your management report and meeting agenda is put together. Your association might be slightly different, but these are kind of the standard sections that you'll have. So usually the first order of business is action items. So these are items that need approval, such as your meeting minutes from the last board meeting, or maybe a proposal for an annual HVAC contract. These are items that need to be approved and voted on by the board. You can also do what are called affirmations during this time. In this day and age, a lot of boards, we make decisions in between meetings via email, and it's a time to sort of officially affirm the approval that was made via email for the record keeping purposes and for the meeting minutes. Next are the informational items. A lot of time, not a lot of time should really be spent on this during the meeting. This is really just a recap of things that have happened throughout the month that the board should be informed of. So essentially it's informational for your information. Next is old business. These are items that have been discussed at the last board meeting. Perhaps the decision was not made, and now it's an item that needs further discussion or decisions made, and those items are talked about during old business. Next is new business. This is the portion of the meeting where new items are added to the agenda. So it's typically a topic that you're discussing for the very first time. And then finally at the end is typically executive session. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where legal matters are discussed, violations and things that are more sensitive or confidential. Just a couple tips for successful board meetings. Board meetings should really only be 45 minutes to 2 hours in length. Once the meeting goes beyond 2 hours, you're really losing a lot attention, and it's kind of a sign that it may not be a very productive meeting. If you are a board that you're finding yourself going over your allotted 2 hours every single month, a timed agenda is a great option. Timed agendas basically set aside a certain amount of time for each of the categories, such as action items, informational items, old business, and they really help you keep on track throughout the meeting. We do ask that you as board members take the time to review the materials prior. That way you are familiar with the items that are going to be discussed, and you can also ask for any revisions prior. And then also just another quick tip is that it's really important to follow the order of the agenda. You want to make sure that you are dedicating enough time to each item and you're not skipping around, because if you do that, you might overlook something that needed discussion and then it'll have to wait until the following month. Next are your meeting minutes. So the meeting minutes are the legal record of the association, and they provide a historic log for the future. The meeting minutes also allow homeowners to stay informed of all the board actions. Typically, meeting minutes are posted to the portal for homeowner review. So in the example of an association that has closed board meetings, it's really the way that the homeowners find out what the board is discussing and some of the pertinent items that are happening within the association currently. The secretary is typically the member of the board who is responsible for taking the meeting minutes. Sometimes if the secretary is not there or there's someone else who feels more apt at taking minutes, they can do so, but typically it's your secretary that takes the meeting minutes. Just another quick tip, managers should really not record the meeting minutes, as they need to be engaged and not writing down items and trying to discuss at the same time. Just some items that should be included within the meeting minutes when they're drafted. It should include the name of the association, what time the meeting was called to order and adjourned, who is present and absent, and then any actions or motions taken during the meeting. And as we discussed earlier, the items in executive session are considered confidential, so there should be separate meeting minutes taken for the open portion or the sort of that, the board meeting versus the executive session. And meeting minutes should really be a summary of what was discussed, not a transcript, and they should follow the order of the meeting agenda. All right, so lastly, just some reminders for board members. As far as the conduct of meeting, boards should really utilize a formal process for approvals. The most commonly used one is Robert's Rules of Order for conducting your meetings. This consists of someone making a motion, someone seconding it, the motion being open to discussion, and then a vote taking place on the motion. And you should also give ample opportunity for all board members to discuss and provide their opinions so everyone feels like they really have input. Just again, a reminder about confidentiality. The executive session should not be discussed outside of the meeting. Lawsuits, and again, the examples of those are lawsuits, collections, and violations regarding specific homeowners or specific matters. And we do also suggest that you create a board-only email address for record keeping purposes. You should use that email address for all of your board business. It keeps everything organized in one place. And if there's ever some sort of legal matter down the line, that email address would be discoverable versus your personal email address. And lastly, we really do ask that all board members be engaged. You guys are off to a great start by being here this evening. Clearly, you're engaged in the process, but we ask, that you try to attend all meetings. We do understand that things do come up from time to time, but as a board member, that's something that you're committing to, is coming to the monthly meeting or however frequently your board meets. Really trying to participate in discussions and decisions, which goes back to making sure that you're prepared for the meeting and reviewing pertinent materials. And then also make sure that you're checking your email regularly. Most of our boards, that's how we communicate with you on a day-to-day basis. So it's important that you're kind of keeping up with your email correspondence. So that is all I have for board meeting basics. I will now turn it over to Julia, who will be going over association financials and the capital reserves.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for all of that useful information, and I hope that everybody got something out of that. So now I will review the main reports from our standard CAMCO financials. It's not going to be everything that you receive in your monthly financial reports from us, but these are kind of the main reports that are going to be useful as a board member. We'll also discuss capital reserve funding and planning. And the reason why we'll go over both of these items, or all three of these items, is basically they're important elements to the board's fiduciary responsibility, as Lauren spoke about, for your association. So let's get started here. And I turned on my spotlight, so hopefully my pointer is working well here. So this is the first page of your association's financials that you will receive. This is obviously for a different association, but it should look similar to this. This is called the narrative. So essentially with the narrative, you'll see at the very top here for which month it's for. And then when you work down here, this is showing you basically your income versus expenses, and then your net total at the bottom. Always throughout the report on the left-hand side is going to be your month to date or your current. And then on the right-hand side is going to be your year to date. You'll see that on the following income statement report as well. It's a similar setup with the left versus right side. So you can see this association for December, these are their actuals, and then here's their variances. And basically the variances are what they actually took in versus what they had budgeted, what they took in and expended versus what they had budgeted for this period, and then also for year to date. So I included December because that's typically an important month for associations if you're on a calendar year, because that would be basically how you ended your year out. So your year to date should be close to what you had budgeted. So for this particular association, if we look at the bottom line or the net total here, they're right around where they should have been for the year. So they had a slight surplus of $1,190. The next section here is just showing this association's cash position. So you can see they have a checking account, a money market account, they have 2 Citadel accounts, they have a Janney Montgomery Scott ready asset account, and it just shows you the breakdown of how much is in each account. The next section you'll see is the accounts receivable. So how much money is owed in total from owners. And you will see basically the difference between this current month on the top and last month. So they're down by $3,540. They were able to retrieve that this month versus last month. So that's good. Next, they have their unpaid invoices. So that's just invoices that they have received but not paid out. And then any accrued expenses. So any expenses or invoices that they have not received the invoice yet, but they know that it's coming, such as a water bill or an electric bill or something like that. The next section here is just a breakdown of what those accrued expenses are. So you can see it ties in here. It's only $359 for the month. And then it gives you the breakdown of what that $359 is for. Next is your operating reserve status. So I think that, you know, for many board members, the sort of your net total here at the top, and then your operating reserve and your capital reserve fund statuses are pretty important when you're reviewing the financials. So you can see for this particular association in prior years, and it says prior year, but it means years, all years leading up to the current year, they had a operating reserve running total of negative 8,056. This year, they currently have that surplus of 1,190. So that leaves them still with a slight deficit of $6,865. So not horrible, but obviously, you know, you want to make sure that you have, you know, that you're not running a deficit, because essentially when you're doing that, you're borrowing from your reserves to do so. Then you can see in their capital reserve status here, they have 448,393. You can also see their prior year reserve fund, what they have contributed for the current year funding, 75,000, and then what expenses they've paid out. This also includes their capital contribution fund, or their working capital as they have phrased it on here. So that new owner buy-in fee from prior years and then current year as well. And then any interest they've received on their CD accounts. And then last but not least, it just reviews the capital expenditures that have been paid out for the year. So you can see specifically who the contractor was and how much was paid out for that particular capital expense. So the next page is the balance sheet. So again, it's similar. It's a lot of the information that's on this page is on the narrative. So again, it gives you that cash breakdown. Essentially what it's doing on the balance sheet is it's breaking it up into assets, liabilities, and then equity. Some of the categories that you'll see on here that you did not see on the narrative are your prepaid expenses. So prepaid insurance, prepaid federal income taxes, if applicable, prepaid other. You may see others for your specific association that are on here as prepaid as well. You can see your accounts receivable are actually tied in here as an asset because those are monies due to the association. So you can see that amount here. And then for this particular association, they had a deck project that was being billed back individually to the homeowners. So that is what this particular amount is. So again, based on your association, you might have some different categories here. Your liabilities, you'll see that prepaid assessments is included in here. So basically that just means if a homeowner has paid in advance for, let's just say, the year or even a month in advance, it still is considered a liability, because if that homeowner was to move out tomorrow, essentially you would owe them that money back. This also includes some accounts payable. We have some processing fees on here and our accrued expenses again. Our equity sections again include our prior year replacement reserves, current year replacement reserve funding, any replacement reserve expenses, again, our capital contribution accounts, and then this also includes our operating reserve. So you can see prior year operating reserve, and then this ties in our net total amount of $1,190. And the last report that I'll show you for the financial packet here is the statement of revenues and expenses, which can also be referred to as the income statement. So you'll see here at the top section, this is your operating side. And then the bottom portion here, this is your expense side. And again, this is going to break it up into the month or the current period on the left-hand side, and then the year to date here on the right-hand side. You'll see that each section broken up has actual, budget, and variance. So the budget just refers to for that particular period. So for this, it would be for the month of December. For the budget period here, because we are in the last month of the year, it is the actual annual budget, but that will change based on the particular month of the financial report that you're receiving. So sometimes you might want to see the actual year-to-date amount compared to what the total annual budget is, and that would be right here on the far right. So you'll see here the owner's assessment. So that's typical for every single association. Those are just your regular monthly or quarterly or annual condo or HOA fees that are coming in. And then you'll have your miscellaneous income categories, which could vary depending on your particular association. This particular association has key fobs, maintenance income, violation and fine charges, etc. Next, when you get down to your operating expenses here, you'll typically see your utilities. Some communities might have payroll sections above here as well. And then you'll get into your separate categories such as maintenance, central systems, grounds maintenance, etc. So when you're looking at the income statement, a lot of times you want to focus on what the variances are. Typically when you're reviewing them, it is good, especially since we are at the last month of the year here for this particular report, you want to see where the variances are. So you'll look in this variance category here. So for instance, this particular community has spent $29,188 for their maintenance and repairs expense line item. They only budgeted $8,000. So at that point, when you're budgeting, which would be a few months before you receive these financials, but you would see a trend here and you would say, okay, should we increase the maintenance line item for 2022? Or was this for a one-off situation where, you know, we don't think it's going to happen next year? If we see our utilities are trending a little bit above what we had budgeted for the year, we definitely want to increase them for the following year. So hopefully that was useful with our financial reports. Like I said, there are some subsequent reports that are also included within our CAMCO monthly financial report, but this is sort of the crux of what you want to look at. And definitely your manager can go over whatever specific reports are in the financials that you may have other questions on. So next we will focus on reserve studies. And the reason why we are tying this in is because the reserve study is basically what you need to determine your reserve funding, which goes into your budget and your operating, basically your operating budget for the year. So what is a reserve study? So a reserve study is an in-depth evaluation of a property's physical components and an analysis of the cost and time frame for anticipated replacements or major repairs to common elements. So it includes both a physical and a financial component to the reserve study. So I know that's very wordy, but essentially it's a guideline for the board and for management to use to basically say, okay, this is how much you should be saving each year, and this is how much you should essentially budget within your operating budget each year. So typically associations are going to hire an independent engineering firm to conduct this analysis to prepare for capital replacement projects and funding. So some associations will utilize firms that they've used in the past for a reserve study, or if they don't have one, definitely your manager can guide you and get you proposals for different firms to utilize. So typically within the reserve study, the projections are going to be about 30 years out. But we do recommend, and actually it's becoming more and more of a requirement, that associations get them updated between 3 to 5 years, especially if you're getting a lot of projects done. So the physical analysis, basically this is a breakdown of everything that the reserve engineer is doing when they come on site to basically look at all of the components that your property may have. So basically they're going to inventory all of the major common area components. They're going to assess each component's current condition and remaining useful life. So I just want to say as a caveat, they typically come and do a site inspection for, I would say, half a day. Just to give you a heads up, it's not an invasive inspection or anything like that. So they're going with a general guideline, and they're also basing it off of information that we provide to them. So when was this last replaced? When was that last replaced? So they're not doing any in-depth investigations to determine these conditions. They'll also describe how the assessment was conducted within the report. They give cost estimates for each component's repair or replacement, and then they'll give you sources on how they obtain those cost estimates. So again, they're just doing a visual inspection, and they're going to ask us for more details on when those items were repaired or replaced recently that we may know of. When there is a specific project noted that is nearing its end of its useful life, the manager and board can then seek proposals from contractors on specific costs. The reserve study is a guideline on the cost, but the proposals will give the actual amounts that it will cost. I did hear from an engineering firm that the cost that they project should be within about a 10% radius of what it actually costs when you get those proposals. Unless it's a reserve study that was conducted a long time ago, then it can change, like we're seeing right now a little bit with the CPI increases. Financial analysis. So basically this portion of the reserve study is going to give a summary of the reserve amount needed for the projected expenses. It's going to give you an evaluation of what those expenses are based on what you're currently funding to your reserve balance. So how much are you currently funding and how much is in your reserve balance? And from that, they're giving you a recommendation of the annual funding to offset the expenses that they see coming up. And basically, they'll give you a description of the methods used to compute the funding status. So the summary of the reserve amount will also include the projected years in which the expense will occur. So it will break it down over that 30-year period and show you exactly what will be expended in each year and what the total is for each year within that report. And yes, like we said, the funding plan will review the current funding levels with projected funding needs based on replacements. So here are some of the benefits of a reserve study. So number one, just like Lauren was talking about, and like we said at the beginning of this portion of the presentation, board fiduciary duty compliance. So the board fiduciary compliance is basically to ensure that you are funding your reserves properly and that you're reviewing replacement projects when necessary. It's a communication tool because if you have to increase your monthly fees or your quarterly fees, or you have to implement a special assessment, or you have to take out a loan to basically fund some of these projects, the reserve study is a very useful communication tool to describe to your owners why you're doing it. And last but not least, it will help you to prioritize capital projects and preventative maintenance. So there might be projects on there that, the board and management may have known about, but may have not thought to get a head start on as the reserve study is projected. Maybe there's less useful remaining life that's projected on that reserve study. So it's basically a great guide in terms of project planning. And then just to get a little bit into the capital planning. So again, it's deciphering which projects should be reviewed and in what order. again, it's not 100% that you have to do it in that order. It's a guideline. So you want to obtain proposals for definitive costs on the upcoming projects, involve engineers and architects where applicable. If you're doing, a large roof replacement project, you want to get an engineering firm involved. The reason why is because they will help you to develop specifications for the project to make sure it's done properly. And they can also help to oversee the project to make sure that, that particular contractor is installing that particular roof as, as it was laid out within their specifications. And then again, remember that the remaining useful life in a reserve study is an estimate. The components in the reserve study can last longer, or they may need replacement before it is projected in the reserve study itself. And then here is our Vanica board portal plug. So we do board portal trainings twice per month. The Vanica board portal is a great transparency tool for our board members. So as you can see on the screen here, this is just a board members portal, and you actually should have this separate board actions tab that when you click on it, it gives you this full menu down here that regular homeowners don't have. So it's a very, very useful tool to you as a board member. You can look at any invoices processed, open violations, work orders. You can see separate homeowners accounts. So if you haven't joined us for one of our board portal trainings, we strongly encourage you to, just to see, what we are offering within the system. We do have 2 upcoming trainings in May. We have already had our 2 trainings for April, but we do send out invitations just like we did for this particular training, but the next ones are on May 12th at noon and then May 24th at 6 p.m. And that is what we have for our presentation. So now I will stop sharing and we will open it up for any questions.